General Hospital spoilers tease that Jason had encountered countless threats over the years: assassins, traitors, cartel leaders, and psychopaths hiding behind polished facades, but nothing had ever chilled him to the core like the realization he now faced: Britt Westbourne, the woman he once shared a fragile, redemptive connection with, was not only alive but had been secretly and obsessively watching Michael and Sasha's infant daughter, Daisy. It began with a faint echo in his gut. A disturbance in his instincts. Jason knew how to trust silence, how to read patterns in the stillness. When Sasha began mentioning strange occurrences, Daisy's baby monitor cutting out unexpectedly, toys being rearranged, and the feeling of being watched, Jason initially considered the usual suspects: media stalkers, former enemies, or even someone tied to Sunny's past. But the evidence soon pointed in a direction that defied everything he thought he knew. It started with a still image, a security camera catch outside Daisy's daycare. A blurry figure, hooded, distant, but with just enough visibility to make the shape of the face recognizable to Jason. He studied it obsessively, zooming, rotating, enhancing, until finally, under a harsh spotlight, the unthinkable became undeniable. It was Britt. Her posture, her gaze, her unmistakable presence despite the grainy footage. She had been there, not once, not by coincidence, but multiple times. Often lingering longer than any casual passerby ever would. At first, Jason refused to believe it. Britt was supposed to be dead, a tragic casualty at the hands of the Hook killer. A chapter closed and buried in grief. But this image shattered that certainty. She was alive. And she was watching Daisy. Jason's mind reeled. Why Daisy? Why now? What was Britt doing? As he dug deeper, he discovered more disturbing patterns. Phone records linked to a burner cell placing Britt near the Quartermain estate at odd hours. Traffic cam footage showing a vehicle registered to a deceased alias parked for hours outside Sasha's home. More surveillance clips, low resolution, but enough to suggest the same figure walking the perimeter of the daycare, again and again, always just out of reach, always vanishing before anyone noticed. He found traces of her, small, eerie signs, like Daisy's favorite stuffed bunny placed back in her crib when Sasha swore she hadn't touched it. Or lullabies played softly through the monitor when no one in the house had turned them on. These weren't the actions of a woman casually observing from afar. They were the meticulous behaviors of someone emotionally entangled, someone who believed she had a claim. Jason knew obsession when he saw it. But this was different. This wasn't hatred or revenge. This was delusion, a dangerous, growing detachment from reality that had overtaken Britt's identity. He remembered the woman who had once tried to reform. Who had walked away from madness to embrace decency, who had even died, or so he thought, on the cusp of redemption. But what he now saw was a ghost returning, not with unfinished business, but with an emotional hole so deep that it had swallowed her completely. Britt's eyes, even in still frames, spoke of someone unraveling. She wasn't stalking Daisy out of malice. She was consumed by an imagined purpose, one that had spiraled into something she could no longer control. Jason's thoughts raced back to Britt's trauma, her stolen motherhood, the embryo scandal. The son she bore and returned, the redemption she craved but never fully embraced. Had those buried emotions festered in hiding, transforming into an obsession with a child who was never hers? Was Daisy just a symbol, a blank canvas onto which Britt had projected all her regrets, all her losses? If so, it made her more dangerous than any enemy with a gun. Because this kind of madness wasn't predictable. It wasn't rational. It was feral, unchained, and it wouldn't stop until it took what it believed was owed. The weight of the truth pressed down on Jason like a lead blanket. He knew what came next. He'd have to confront her. He'd have to track her down, find out where she'd been hiding, how she'd survived, and more importantly, how far she was willing to go. But what haunted him was something deeper, a flicker of guilt. Had he failed her? Had his silence, his absence, his belief that she was dead contributed to the unraveling of her mind? There was no time for regret, but the thought lingered like an ache in his chest. The revelation that Britt was the one watching Daisy redefined everything. It turned a cold case into a live wire, a dormant grief into an urgent threat. Jason was no longer dealing with a theoretical danger. He was staring down a woman he once cared for, now unrecognizable, and potentially unstable enough to take a child. Every instinct screamed that the situation was escalating. Britt's movements were becoming more brazen, her presence more frequent. The obsession wasn't fading, it was growing. And Jason feared that if he didn't act swiftly, a tragedy would unfold. His thoughts shifted from protection to strategy. The question wasn't just how to stop her, but how to reach her, if there was anything left to reach. Could Britt be brought back from the edge, or was she already too far gone? Would she listen to him? Or would she see him as another threat to the fantasy world she'd constructed around Daisy? These were answers Jason needed, and quickly. Because one thing was now certain. Britt was no longer just a name from the past. She was the storm circling closer with each passing day. And Daisy, innocent, vulnerable, unaware, was standing directly in the eye of it. Jason knew the clock was ticking. He could no longer rely on institutions to keep Daisy safe. The law didn't understand obsession. Court orders didn't stop ghosts. It was up to him now. He had to uncover every trace, every step Britt had taken, and intercept whatever madness she was preparing before it reached Sasha's doorstep. Because this wasn't just about protecting a child anymore. It was about saving a woman who had once been loved, and stopping the broken version of her before she did something neither of them could ever take back. Britt's escalating interference in Daisy's life was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence or emotional confusion. It had become a looming threat. One that was growing more volatile by the day. Her presence around Sasha and Michael's daughter had crossed the line from unsettling to dangerous. What once might have been explained away as a grief-stricken woman searching for closure had now twisted into something much darker, more erratic, and deeply unstable. Britt wasn't just watching Daisy, she was inserting herself into the child's world in increasingly disturbing ways, leaving behind traces of obsession that no longer felt harmless. And with every step closer she crept toward Daisy, the danger surrounding the little girl intensified. Evolving into a storm of psychological and emotional instability that was spiraling out of control. This was no longer just about Britt's trauma, it was about control. About possession. About a fractured mind convincing itself that Daisy belonged to her in some way, that fate or pain or destiny had tied them together. Jason saw the signs, the blurred boundaries. The way Britt lingered just long enough to be noticed but never caught, the subtle manipulations of Daisy's surroundings that no ordinary person would think to question. These were not the actions of a grieving woman. They were the patterns of someone losing their grip on reality, acting on impulses rooted in delusion and unresolved obsession. And it was becoming clear that Britt's behavior wasn't just a threat to Daisy's safety, it was a sign of a deeper madness now rising to the surface. This dangerous shift marked a turning point. A line that could no longer be ignored. Jason realized that the woman he had once loved, the one who had fought for redemption and almost died in pursuit of peace, had now transformed into something entirely different. Britt was no longer seeking healing. She was acting on something twisted and dangerous, a compulsion to insert herself into Daisy's life regardless of consequences. And with that came a terrifying reality. The Britt he had known was gone, replaced by someone capable of crossing lines he never imagined she would. The insanity of it all left Jason reeling. He had seen Britt fight so hard to become better. To shed the darkness of her past, to step into the light. But now she had regressed, or worse, evolved, into someone who believed a child could somehow fill the hole inside her. Her actions weren't fueled by hatred, but by love corrupted. And that made her even more dangerous. Because love, when twisted by trauma and delusion, could justify anything, even the unthinkable. Jason knew what had to be done. He had to confront her. He had to stand between Britt and Daisy, not as the man who once held her hand in the dark, but as the protector who would not allow his past to consume an innocent future. It tore at him, the thought of seeing Britt again under these circumstances. The thought of stopping someone he once would have died for. But there was no choice. This wasn't just a crisis, it was a collision between memory and reality, love and madness, redemption and ruin. And in that moment, Jason felt the weight of a nightmare he had never prepared for crashing down on him. Because Britt wasn't a faceless threat. She wasn't a distant enemy or a criminal hiding behind lawyers. She was the woman who had once brought him back from the brink, the one he thought he had lost to death. But now, he faced the cruelest twist of all. She had returned not as a miracle, but as a monster made of grief, longing, and emotional collapse. The shock of it reverberated through Jason's soul. He couldn't save Britt from what she'd become, not now. His only mission was to save Daisy. And with every step Britt took, the urgency rose. The nightmare was no longer approaching. It had arrived. Jason could feel it in his bones. The person he once loved most in the world was now the person he would have to stop, and possibly destroy, to protect an innocent child from becoming collateral in a tragedy that had already taken oh much from too many. Britt's descent into obsession had once been a shadow, something Jason sensed on the periphery, something that whispered rather than screamed. But now, it had a name, a face. A target. The lines between grief and delusion had collapsed completely, and what remained was a woman spiraling into dangerous territory. The object of her fixation, baby Daisy. The daughter of Michael and Sasha. It wasn't subtle anymore. Britt had begun interfering in ways that no longer resembled passive longing or accidental proximity. She was actively altering Daisy's environment, tampering with baby monitors, leaving objects behind in the nursery, even triggering security alarms at odd hours before vanishing like a ghost. Each incident layered upon the next, forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore and more impossible to excuse. Jason, who had spent his life navigating through lies and threats, could no longer deny what he was witnessing. Britt, the woman he had once protected, once kissed in the dark during fleeting moments of shared vulnerability, had become a danger. Not just to herself. Not just to the memory of who she once was, but to an innocent child who had no idea she was at the center of a growing storm. The severity of it struck Jason with a kind of pain he wasn't used to. This wasn't just a betrayal. It wasn't just a mission. It was heartbreak laced with horror. Because the woman stalking Daisy wasn't some stranger, it was someone he had loved. And now he was being forced to prepare for war against her. What made the situation even more devastating was that Britt didn't seem to recognize the danger of her actions. In her mind, what she was doing was love, protection, connection, even destiny. Jason had retrieved a journal from an abandoned safe house she had used, and the writings inside were chilling in their intensity. Pages upon pages of notes about Daisy, her routine, her smile, her cries, the way she held her stuffed animals. Drawings. Plans. Obsessive musings that indicated a total psychological break. There were even entries where Britt imagined scenarios of motherhood, not just raising Daisy, but rescuing her from Michael and Sasha. It was no longer a question of if Britt might do something unthinkable, it was a question of when. The realization hit Jason like a blow to the chest. Britt's delusion wasn't passive. It was accelerating. Her actions were no longer confined to distance or secrecy. She was becoming emboldened, more brazen, and dangerously confident that what she was doing was right. The way she maneuvered around security systems, the way she used back entrances and surveillance blind spots, proved that she was planning. She wasn't acting on impulse, she was preparing for something, and that was far more dangerous. Because someone who believes they're on a mission of love is far harder to stop than someone acting out of hatred. Jason's instincts, honed from decades of living on the edge of chaos, screamed that time was running out. Every sign pointed toward an inevitable confrontation. But the emotional weight of it was suffocating. This was not a nameless threat or a hired gun sent by a rival. This was Britt. The woman who had once stood beside him during some of his darkest nights. The woman who had smiled through pain. Who had made him feel something human when he had almost forgotten how. And now she had become a twisted reflection of herself, undone by trauma and reborn as something he could no longer protect. He had spent years cleaning up the aftermath of other people's choices, taking lives when necessary, vanishing threats before they reached the people he loved. But nothing had prepared him for this, for having to confront Britt, not as a friend in need, but as a danger that had to be stopped. The idea of putting himself between her and Daisy wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. It was the moment his past and present collided in the worst possible way. He had to face the fact that love could transform into madness. That memory could become a weapon. That Britt, in her broken mind, didn't see herself as a kidnapper or a villain, she saw herself as a mother denied. Each night, Jason lay awake, replaying every moment they had shared. The late-night confessions. The stolen moments of peace, the laughter that had once given him hope for a life beyond violence. But those memories had become poisoned by the reality of the present. Now, every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the woman who had loved him. He saw her standing in Daisy's room, watching, waiting, believing that what she was doing was love. And that image had become his nightmare. A nightmare that grew closer with every hour. Jason understood that he couldn't afford to hesitate. If he faltered, even for a second, Britt could take Daisy. She could disappear. She could cross a line that could never be undone. And then the guilt would be his to carry forever. So he hardened himself, stripping away the emotion, preparing for what had to come. He assembled a team, secured Sasha's home with layers of protection, and began tracking Britt's movements in real time. But no matter how tactical he became, the emotional devastation remained just beneath the surface. Because deep down, he still wished there was a way to save her. But Jason knew the truth, some people returned from the dead changed. And Britt hadn't come back to heal. She had come back to complete something in her own mind, even if it meant destroying others to do it. This wasn't just obsession anymore. It was a delusion that had evolved into a mission. And Jason, for the first time, wasn't fighting to protect Port Charles from a faceless threat. He was fighting to save a child from the person he had once wanted to build a life with. And that was the nightmare. Not the danger itself, but the cruel twist of fate that forced him to choose between love and duty, and know, without a doubt, that this time, love had already lost. The story of Britt's return had already shaken Port Charles, but what lay beneath the surface, buried beneath her carefully masked reappearance, was far more sinister than anyone imagined. As her obsession with baby Daisy escalated, so too did the trail of secrets she had tried to keep hidden. Now, those dark pieces of her past, ones even Jason never knew, were beginning to unravel. And with them came a disturbing revelation. Britt had not simply returned from the dead, she had returned transformed, forged by trauma and madness into something dangerous. The haunting truths she carried were more than emotional scars. They were the blueprints of a mind fractured by guilt, loss, and an obsession that had metastasized into something uncontrollable. The past was no longer something she could outrun. Whispers began to surface, stories of where Britt had been, what she had done to survive, and what she had sacrificed. Rumors suggested she had spent time under another identity, living among criminal elements across Europe, seeking underground medical procedures to treat trauma that went far beyond the physical. There were whispers of her involvement with rogue fertility clinics, unsanctioned genetic experimentation, and stolen embryo trafficking rings. Each piece added another layer of horror, suggesting that Britt's fixation on Daisy was not a random delusion, it was the culmination of years of secrecy, pain, and moral erosion. The shockwaves rippled outward as new evidence emerged. A sealed file, long buried in WSB archives, documented Britt's connection to a black market operation that had experimented on infants born through unauthorized IVF programs. She had once been involved, albeit reluctantly, as a way to redeem herself following the Rocco scandal, but somewhere along the line, she lost her way. Her motivations blurred. Her morals collapsed. What had started as penance became obsession. And now, all those failures, all those regrets, had found a new focus in Daisy. She didn't just want to protect the child, she believed the child was hers. Symbolically if not biologically. In her broken mind, Daisy was a second chance. A replacement. A correction of history. The revelation of these past actions shocked even those who thought they knew Britt best. Jason, haunted by his discovery of her surveillance on Daisy, now found himself piecing together a much darker puzzle, one that went beyond grief or trauma. This was deliberate. This was part of a calculated descent into obsession. Britt's adjustments, as she once called them in her journal, were in fact clinical manipulations, routines tailored to influence Daisy's emotional responses. Subtle changes in environment meant to trigger imprinting behavior, toys placed intentionally to evoke familiarity. It was no longer simply stalking. It was psychological conditioning. As this deeper truth came to light, Jason could feel the stakes rising. This wasn't just about Daisy's safety anymore, it was about the unraveling of a long-suppressed past that had finally erupted to the surface. Britt wasn't simply obsessed. She had created an entire fantasy rooted in science, regret, and emotional devastation. Her mind had adjusted the past to justify the present. And now she was acting with the full force of someone who believed she had been wronged by fate itself. The town, once sympathetic to her reappearance, began to turn. The media caught wind of the scandal, and headlines exploded. Doctor of Darkness returns with a child in her sights, Britt Westbourne and the legacy of stolen lives. Families whispered behind closed doors. Hospitals reevaluated their hiring records. And through it all, Britt disappeared again, vanishing just as more questions were being asked. But Jason knew she wasn't gone. She was circling. Watching. Waiting. This new wave of revelations brought a chilling clarity. The true danger was not just in what Britt might do next, but in how deeply she believed she was right. Every adjustment she made, every secret she buried, every life she touched had been leading to this moment. Daisy was not the beginning of Britt's descent, she was the endgame. The proof that her madness had purpose. And Jason, torn between grief and fury, knew he had no choice. The past had caught up with them all, and its consequences were terrifyingly real. The nightmare was no longer abstract. It had a face, a name, a history soaked in sorrow and self-deception. And as Jason prepared to do what he never thought he'd be forced to do, confront Britt not as a woman he loved, but as a danger he had to neutralize, he felt the weight of the final, devastating truth. Sometimes the greatest threats aren't born in hatred, but in love gone mad. And Britt, now fully consumed by the ghosts of her past, had become one of the most unpredictable threats Port Charles had ever known.